Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Our next speaker is Laila Abdelaziz. She is the Legislative and Government Affairs Director for the Florida Council on American Islamic Relations. Laila is responsible for advancing CAIR's Florida mission and vision in Florida's municipal, county, and state governments. Her focus is to establish better understanding and stronger relationships between Florida's Muslim American community and the elected leaders who represent and serve them. Previously, she has served as Emerge USA's Tampa Bay Regional Director. Between 2011 and 2014, she held many roles at Emerge USA, where she managed the organization's Emerging Leaders Program and represented the Muslim American community in Tallahassee during legislative session. During her time in Tallahassee, Laila was able to develop a strong sense of awareness regarding Florida's political and governmental process and aims to apply this experience to better serve Florida's Muslim American community. In 2012, Laila was appointed to the city by the City of Tampa Mayor Bob Buckhorn to serve on the City of Tampa Human Rights Board. And she prides herself in being a community organizer and is involved in various community and political organizations and campaigns. She enjoys reading and reflective writing and has been published in various states and national news outlets and publications. Born in Ramallah, Palestine, to a Palestinian father and a Russian mother, and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. Please welcome Laila Abdelaziz.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Manatee County Tiger Bay Club for having me and for hosting this very important conversation. It's very relevant to all of us as Americans. So I think that it's really interesting that we're having this conversation, particularly about Syrian refugees and whether the United States should welcome Syrian refugees or whether we should be concerned. And I kind of want to backtrack a little bit and go back to when we started having this conversation. As Americans, we saw this wave of governors and states and state members of Congress, U.S. senators, start attacking the status of Syrian refugees entering the United States after the tragedy in Paris. And why did this happen, right? Why was all of a sudden was there a concern that Syrian refugees are a risk to our national security here as Americans? Because that's what fundamentally this is about, right? Because as Floridians, as Americans, there are refugees that are resettled throughout the country from all over the world. And the majority of refugees that are resettled in Florida actually come from Latin America. Less than 5% of the refugees that were resettled in Florida between 2014 and 2015 were from Muslim majority countries. And of that less than 5%, I think it was about 150 Syrians. So in the federal fiscal year of 2014 to 2015, there were 150 Syrians actually resettled in the United States. There have been about 2,000 Syrians resettled throughout the United States, and what we're seeing is these are Syrians with very dire medical needs, very dire medical concerns. But, this has become a political issue because what governors are saying, what members of Congress are saying, and what senators are saying is that we should be concerned about our national security, specifically because of Syrian refugees. Now, this goes back to Paris because there were reports that after the tragic attack in Paris, there was a Syrian refugee passport found in the ruins of the attacks. Since then, we have learned from European officials, from French officials, and from German officials that all perpetrators of the attacks in Paris were European nationals from France or Belgium. So it's very important to understand this distinction, that there were no Syrian refugees, according to official statements, according to the official investigations that have followed the Paris tragedies. There were no Syrian refugees involved in the tragic attacks in Paris. And yet, we're having a conversation about closing our borders to Syrian refugees. Refugees, the global, Tom discussed the global refugee community and it's tens of millions of people. The most conservative estimate says that there are 20 million global refugees throughout the world. A more liberal estimate says 30 to 40 million refugees throughout the world. But since the Arab Spring and the conflict that has arisen in Syria, what you've seen is close to 11 million internally and externally displaced Syrians. You have 4 million Syrians that are displaced from their homeland. And I do want to reference that the majority of Syrians that have been displaced externally from Syria have actually gone into the border states in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. This is where the majority, 3 million of the proposed 4 million refugees that have externally left Syria are actually in the neighboring countries. But there's hundreds of thousands of Syrians that are seeking refuge in Europe. And that poses the question, why are hundreds of thousands of people risking their lives, putting all of their money into this travel to get to Europe? Why is this happening? For several decades now, refugee camps throughout the Middle East have no longer become temporary settings for temporary political conflicts. What you have found now is that there are generations of refugees being born in refugee camps into very desolate spaces, no economic opportunities, no educational opportunities. Now you have an entire generation of Syrians that are being displaced because of the largest humanitarian crisis of our times. I mean, people agree with that politically across the board. This is the most dire humanitarian crisis that our generation is faced with in the 21st century. Syrians, because of the political carnage internally within Syria, you have an entire generation of young Syrians that have no educational opportunities, have lost their homes, have lost contact with their families, have absolutely no opportunity. So as we discuss the status of refugees, what we should also keep in mind is what is the status of attaining political stability in the Middle East so that we don't have to continue talking about the status of refugees globally. There is a concern, as 31 governors in 31 states have said, that Syrian refugees will threaten the national security of the United States. But no one is really talking about the status of a refugee visa entering the United States. So there's a global refugee population, and the UNHCR is the agency that's vetted by the international organization to vet refugees and define whether someone is a refugee or not. There is a very defined international definition of what it means to be a refugee. And by definition, refugees are people who are not protected by their government. That is why, under international treaties and international obligations, the international community has, since the 1940s, determined that because refugees are by default people that are not protected by their own governments, the international community has to step in and is obligated to step in to provide them with safety and protection from their governments that they're fleeing. So there's a very defined definition of what it means to be a refugee in the international level. And on top of the UNHCR vetting refugees and defining whether individuals are refugees or not, there are international treaties and international conventions. There's the 1951 convention, there's the 1967, I believe, the 1967 Protocol on Refugees, which the international community has signed on to international obligations as to how to define, how to help, and how to deal with refugees. Within the international law, refugees do have rights. They have rights to education, they have rights to travel documents, they have rights to not being sent back to the country that they're fleeing from, they have rights to not being persecuted for illegally entering a country. Because you might ask yourself, like, why is this happening? Why are hundreds of thousands of people, entering Europe? But there are actually rights that protect refugees and maintain that they're allowed to leave the countries that they're being persecuted from. Now, the United States internally as a country has its own domestic policies and its own domestic standards for accepting and resettling refugees. And we have what is really considered some of the highest standards for vetting and resettling refugees. The refugee visa to enter the United States as a refugee, the UNHCR makes a recommendation based on who they define as refugees, what countries will accept these refugees after the UNHCR determines that someone's a refugee. So the UNHCR has now recommended about 19,000 Syrian refugees that it thinks will pass the United States standards for resettling refugees. We have, again, resettled less than 2,000 since. So we're definitely seen by the global community as falling short to our international obligations to resettle refugees. But once a refugee is recommended by the UNHCR to the United States to be resettled here, there are about 5 federal law enforcement agencies that are involved in the vetting process. And firmly understood, the refugee visa is the most thorough screening process, is the most thorough visa status for any person that enters the United States. There are, the vetting process includes the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the FBI. These are all agencies that create a file on a refugee. They do background checks, they check their biometric data across international agencies, they do medical screenings, and Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees specifically have an even more enhanced screening process than all other refugees. So as a reminder, the majority of refugees that are entering the United States are not coming from Syria or Muslim majority countries, but what we are seeing now with the global conflicts of the past several decades, the majority of refugees in the global community are from Muslim majority countries. But because of our resettlement process. And what we've seen is actually the United States standards for screening and vetting refugees have gotten more thorough in the past several decades. At the height of the Bosnian War, which the Bosnian genocide created a global Bosnian refugee community of about 2 million people, and the United States resettled 150,000 individuals. So I know I went over my time. I really apologize. I really wanted to explain the process because there's this fear that refugees that are being resettled in the United States we don't know who they are, we don't know where they're coming from, and we don't know whether they are safe or not. These people are the foremost victims of war crimes, of terrorist activities, and loss of home. This is a global humanitarian concern. This is a global humanitarian crisis. And as Americans, we have a duty to resettle and open our borders to these individuals that are seeking opportunity, stability, and safety in the global community. Thank you.